Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Attacking Israel's right to exist is becoming more mainstream. In many classrooms in the Western world and on social media, Zionism is classified as white colonialism. In progressive circles, Zionists are often no longer welcome. Pop artist Bob Dylan called for go to the streets and find the Zionists. And one of Holland's most popular singers, Douwe Bob, refused to perform for Zionists. Micha Danzig served in the Israeli army and is a former police officer with the NYPD, the New York Police Department. He is currently an attorney and is very active with numerous Jewish and pro-Israel organizations, including Stand With Us and the Friends of the IDF, and is a national board member of Gerut North America. Micha has published articles in the Jewish Journal, the Algemeiner, the Forward, the Jewish News Syndicate, GNS, and has had guest appearances on numerous local and national news shows on topics related to anti-Semitism, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and/or the Middle East. Micha, you must be very busy. Welcome to our
I
podcast, and
am,
thank you for coming on.
but thank you for asking me to be on your show.
So I get to ask the first question today, which is one of the woke allegations against Zionism and the Jewish people is that it is a colonial country replacing the indigenous Palestinian population with Jews. How do you feel about that?
The short answer is that's just another blood libel, right? That's the short version. So that tells you how I feel about it. The longer answer is that it's completely nonsensical. The even longer answer is that it's nonsensical for the following reasons. First and foremost, when there is a colony, there's some dominant culture and metropole, right? That's from a foreign land that sends its people, its military, its emissaries, its agents of commerce, etc., to a foreign land that they have no connection with, and to then export their culture, their language, their system onto that foreign land for the benefit of the metropole that they came from. Where did the Jews come from? Behind me is a map of Israel. The Jews came from here, Israel, right? When French people were in Algeria as colonialists, and there's no disputing that the French were colonialists, and they dug in the ground, they would never find ancient artifacts written in French. When the Dutch were in southern Africa and colonized the area in the beginning in the 1600s, they couldn't dig in the ground and find anything that predates 1600 written in Dutch, right? And when the British were in India and colonized India, again, same thing, right? Pretty straightforward. You couldn't dig in the ground anywhere in the land of India and find anything ancient written in English. I live in Israel. I can't go anywhere in this land from the river to the sea, as they say, without digging and finding something written in Hebrew that I can read, right? That all of us Jews/Hebrews have been reading in our synagogues for the last 2,500 years at least, in a language we all understand from the synagogue, and that says things like freedom for Zion. There's coins. You go to the Jerusalem Museum, the Jewish Museum in Jerusalem, and there are multiple coins from the era of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was near 134 CE, right? A long time before Arabs conquered this land and turned it into part of the Arab Empire that spanned from Saudi Arabia and Baghdad all the way across to Morocco. Almost 500 years before that, there was a Bar Kokhba revolt, and in that Bar Kokhba revolt, they minted coins that said on them "Freedom for Zion" in Hebrew, right?
And where were those found? Where were those found?
They're found mainly around Jerusalem, but they're found all over Israel, all over Israel. By the way, you don't have to go to archaeological sites that there are literally anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists that say that all the archaeology that we've dug up here in Israel is made up. Go to the Arch of Titus in Rome. It's been standing there for 2,000 years, the Arch of Titus. What does the Arch of Titus depict on the inside? The Jews being taken as slaves from Jerusalem to Rome by the Emperor Titus with all the spoils of war from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, right? And there are Roman coins from that same time period that say what in Latin? Judea capta. We've captured Judea. They didn't say we captured Palestine, right? They said we captured Judea. They then, as everyone who studies history knows, they renamed the region Syria Palestina, right? And most people theorize that the reason they gave this entire region the name Syria Palestina, and also tried to change the name of Jerusalem to Alia Capitolina, that didn't stick. But they changed the name to try to erase the Jewish presence and the Jewish memory of the land and in the land.
Wait, let me just clarify that you're saying it's the Romans.
The Romans, yes. Yeah, after two Jewish revolts against Roman rule, one in the year 70 and one started in the year 132, right? The Romans defeated us brutally, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Historians, it's not disputed, say they killed about 1 million of us. They took most of the Jews who were in the center of Judea and put them in exile, mainly took them to Rome as slaves. But there are always Jews who remained in the northern Israel communities that are today part of the Galilee and the Golan Heights. That area was still majority Jewish up until the Arab conquest of the region in the 7th century. So even under the Byzantine Empire, that area remained majority Jewish for all that period.
So Micha, what you're basically saying is colonialism means that a country goes into invades another country or goes to another country and is new there and establishes itself as rulers of a foreign country where they are not indigenously from.
Yeah, where they take a foreign culture, a foreign language, a foreign military, right? And they export it to a land they have no connection with.
Right.
And they impose all of that on that local population.
Right.
And then they colonize that population. You know what's a great example of that happening? What the Arab Empire did to this land in the 7th century. Nobody spoke. There were very few. There were Arabs here. There were always Arabs here from the time of, probably Moab, right? But there were always Arabs here as passing through, as Bedouins, as traders, right? I mean, we obviously know that Petra, which is to the east of us in Jordan, that was an Arab trading post, Arab trading city that predates the conquest of this land by the Arab Empire in the 7th century and around the year 635 CE. But there was no commonly spoken Arab language here, Arab culture, Arab cities here, right? There was nothing Arab about this land in the 7th century until the Arab Empire, spreading from after its full conquest of the entire Arabian Peninsula, going north, conquered the entire Levant, right? And then went through the Levant into Egypt and then ended up conquering all of North Africa over the course of the next 50 years, right? And then what did they do? They took a foreign language, a language that was indigenous not to the land of Israel, which is Hebrew, right? They took a foreign language, Arabic, that's indigenous to the Hijaz, to the Arabian Peninsula. They took a foreign faith that was originated there, Islam, and then they Arabized and Islamized this region, right? Now, certainly there are many, and we know this from genetic studies, there are Palestinian, people who identify today as Palestinian Arabs, who were originally Jews, right? They were in this land during the time of the Byzantine period. Some of them had already converted to Christianity. Some of them had stayed Jews. And then when the Arab conquest occurred in this land in the 7th century, it got tough and tougher and tougher to be Jewish and to be Christian, to be frank. And many of them were Islamized, and certainly all of them were Arabized, right?
Can I just, for our audience, remind people that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, did not even come onto the scene until, 600 and something. So
in the 7th century.
But I want to remind people because they have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we can talk about, there's a comedian, Yoel Sponder, who says, when he talks about things in Israel, he says, before the Common Era, which is before the birth of Jesus, and he also says BI, before Islam, right? And of course, those are two different measurements, right?
By about 600 years, but
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So Micha, you're saying Jews were Jews are not colonial to Israel because they come from there. We have archaeological proof that we were there like thousands of years ago already, and that we have been there throughout history in a larger or smaller amount.
Zionism
So now
is
that
decolonialization.
that Zionism brings us back to Israel, you cannot call that colonial because
No, it's
we come back
decolonialism.
to where we come from. We are not without any connection to Israel, invaders from
Exactly.
Europe or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's the Jews are the indigenous people of this land. We're not saying that nobody else can be indigenous to the land,
right.
but clearly Jews are the indigenous people of this land. Everything that makes a Jew Jewish, everything that matters to the Jewish people originated in this land. Our identity, our culture, our faith, our language, right? Even the pigeons, so to speak, or creoles that we spoke when we were in the diaspora, like Yiddish, are based on Hebrew, right? Everything that makes a Jew, and everything that makes our culture Jewish, our nationality, our peoplehood, etc., originated in this land, the land of Israel.
Except the fur hat on Shabbat that many Hasidim are wearing, that comes from Eastern
By the way,
Europe.
that's not exactly true, because even the shtreimel,
yeah,
right? Even
that is that hat,
yeah,
that fur hat for holidays and Shabbat, right?
The
Yeah.
fur was added. The fur was added because the Hasidic culture was developed in Poland and in Eastern Europe. But the shtreimel itself and the design was based on the type of hats and other things that Jews wore historically in the land of Israel before the Roman conquest, even.
I see.
Right. So even that has its history in this land. But the reality again is that obviously there's a whole lot of stuff that is part of our culture that developed over 2,000 years in various parts of our diaspora. One of the beauties of living in Israel is that I get to eat amazing foods from all over the world that are in some respects very Jewish foods of Jewish communities from other lands, whether it's shakshuka, right, or some kind of chunt, right? But those were developed by Jewish communities that maintained themselves as ethnically and religiously Jewish based on all the important stuff, right, that they brought with them that was developed here in this land, right, including the fact that we pray every year next year in Jerusalem, right? So we are, everything that makes us who we are and that made us who we are, really, right, that matters, came from this land. But again, more importantly, Zionism is decolonialism. It's the Jewish people, the indigenous Jewish people, who are already here in some percentage always, but many in the diaspora returning home. It's not exporting a foreign culture, a culture that's foreign to this land, to a land that had no connection to it. It's bringing the Hebrews back to the land that the Hebrews originated in.
So calling Zionism colonial to me sounds like an insult. Do we agree with that?
It's clearly, we also have to understand how anti-Semitism works, right? In every era, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, blessed be his memory, he said it best, obviously. He talked about anti-Semitism being a mutating virus, that it shapeshifts and it changes with the time, like a virus. And like all viruses, as it's shifting to match the time, it maintains a lot of its core features. So a virus that mutates always has aspects of the old virus in it. So in anti-Semitism always makes the Jew whatever is the least popular at that moment, whatever identifies you, it makes it the easiest to hate the Jew. So during medieval times, Jews were Christ killers. But then, of course, we also started because they were suffering from diseases that they didn't understand that they were getting because they, frankly, were they were living with lice and fleas, and they
Wait,
didn't
wait,
realize they were
let's make it clear. Who was living with lice and fleas? The
right.
Christian,
The Europeans in European countries, right?
right?
We know that the plague, the bubonic plague, was actually caused by fleas, and they were living with their animals in their homes, and they weren't bathing like the Jews were, and they weren't because Jews had ritual baths and mikvahs, and we were bathing all the time. Jews also, unlike the Europeans, ate with utensils at that time, and we washed our hands. We have a Jewish law that requires us to wash our hands before every meal. So as a result, we weren't passing around to each other, and we were forced to live in ghettos mostly with each other. We weren't passing around to each other the bubonic plague. They were in much bigger numbers passing around the bubonic plague. They were getting from the fleas that were transferring from the animals they were living with in their homes and getting sick. So then it was the disease that was scaring them so much. So what the Jews weren't only these evil Christ killers who didn't accept Christ suddenly, they were also the spreaders of plagues, right? The spreaders of disease. And then when children went missing, right, we got the original blood libel, and the Jews were the kidnappers of children, and then that got quickly made into the Jews use the blood of children for our Passover matzah and our Purim pastries, right? And in every generation, it kind of morphed a little bit more. And we got, of course, when the Enlightenment happened and hating people because of their religion in many parts of Europe became out of fashion, then they developed the racialized version of hating Jews. And so Jews were suddenly subhuman. Jews were suddenly those who were looking to mongrelize the white race. And that didn't start with Hitler, but Hitler certainly took that and ran with it and elevated it to being essentially the national platform of the German people and the Nazi Party. So Jews were hated on a racialized basis. And today, because and I'm old enough now, I'm a 61-year-old man. I'm old enough to know when, it was considered to be in America, being white was considered to be, quote, good, and it was a good thing. And then nobody was characterizing Jews as white, right? It was like, you're Jewish, you're a Hebrew, right? I have ancestors who went through Ellis Island. When they arrived at Ellis Island, nobody stamped on their papers white. What they stamped on their papers was Hebrew, right? You were actually stamped as a Hebrew at Ellis Island. And in many of the countries, in Italian, for example, we're not Jews, we're Hebreo, right? Hebrews, right? So, but my ancestors, when they arrived in Ellis Island, those are on my family side. I have ancestors who've been in Jerusalem for 8 centuries, and I have ancestors who arrived in Ellis Island at the turn of the 19th century, at the end of the 9th century. But those who arrived in Ellis Island, nobody considered them when they were put on the Lower East Side to be white. They were expressly told they weren't white, right? Now suddenly, what are the two of the biggest insults in the world? White and colonialist. So now suddenly, what are Jews? White and colonialists. It's the same thing. If you're in a communist country and you want to hate Jews, you say the Jews are the capitalists. If you're in a capitalist country and you want to hate Jews, the Jews are the communists. So that's how anti-Semitism works, right? And so we have to understand the white colonial claim in the broader context of anti-Semitism generally.
So, Evan, let me ask a question. I just think it's a riot that here in America, people think Jews are white only, whereas in Israel, I think it's more than 50% are non-white in terms of what we would consider, and that they don't realize how many Sephardic Jews there are. I live in Los Angeles. There are a lot of Farsi-speaking Jews who are not white, but that doesn't count because we're all tarred with the same brush in terms of white.
Well, again, white in and of itself. So it's very important to understand this, that nobody is truly white, right? I was fiddling with a piece of paper just now so I could show you. This is white, right?
Except for albino. Right.
No human being practically is white. So what does it mean to be white? And what is white? We didn't human beings, Judaism is 3,500 years old. The Jewish people are roughly 3,500 years old. We predate this construct of defining the world along these binary colors. And by the way, we dropped one of them when I was a kid growing up, we talked about there being white, black, and yellow people, right? Nobody talks about yellow people anymore. That's ridiculous. Nobody's yellow. But there was a period of time where we had these social constructs, and it included yellow. Today we have a social construct still of white, and we have to understand that that's exactly what it is. It's a social construct. It's not a real thing. It's not something that there's no actual biological or genetic basis for this. It's just a social construct. It's a social construct that came out of European colonialism, and then it really, really grew in America, right? Because of slavery and because of America's very racialized system, also with respect to Native Americans. So it's a truly American racial identity, right, at its core. Obviously, Hitler and the Nazis really ran with it too. They were ultimate white supremacists, but at its core, it really has its roots in American history now.
And South Africa.
Yeah, for sure. A little different, right? They have a different twist on it with the whole idea of colors and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's all nonsense. And it's nonsense that has nothing to do with being Jewish and Jewish identity. Now, in America, it gets complicated because American Jews were in the beginning actually were all Sephardic, right?
Yes.
They're almost all Portuguese Jews who fled the Spanish Inquisition. But after the Civil War, right? America started having significant immigration from many European countries, and for a period of time until 1924, they allowed a significant number of Jews, particularly poor Jews from Eastern European countries, to immigrate to the United States. And those Jews, for the most part, were Ashkenazim, for the most part, more pale skinned than Jews who come from Spain or Jews who come from Morocco or Jews who come from what was Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq, etc. But even so, many were very, very, very brown, frankly. And they were otherized for their appearance in Europe, and they were also otherized for their appearance often in the United States. And many of them were considered to be, quote, Middle Eastern. And in America, they definitively weren't considered to be, quote, white. And there were many states that had rules that defined Jews as differently. There was redlining of Jews and Black people in cities like Minneapolis through the 50s and 60s. I lived in San Diego.
Let's explain what redlining means.
Sure. So redlining was essentially a way the banks and real estate brokers conspired to make sure that certain neighborhoods were only white, Christian, and that certain neighborhoods were only available for Jews or other minorities, and certain other neighborhoods were only available for Black people, right? And they typically wanted to organize these cities in ways so that Jews and Armenians and sometimes Irish, depending on what was, and Italians, what was the demographic makeup of a city, they tried to organize this redlining so that these what we call buffer communities, which always it was Jews, and sometimes was Armenians, and sometimes was Italians, and sometimes was Irish, but it was always the Jews. These buffer communities would be between the white Christians, typically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, sometimes white Catholics, and Black communities, right? And so that was what redlining was in America. And that really, redlining continued legally until at least the 70s. And it illegally continued in many places afterwards, right? But legally until the 70s. I happened to be, before I moved back to Israel a few years ago, I lived in San Diego for many, many years. And in San Diego, it was illegal. You could not sell a home to a Jew in La Jolla, I believe, until 1972, right? So that was when the University of California, San Diego was trying to recruit top professors from the East Coast so that the University of California, San Diego compete with those schools as a top medical school, as a top engineering school, and some other areas. And they realized that a lot of these top medical school professors and engineering school professors were Jews from the East Coast. And they wanted to bring these Jewish professors to the University of California, San Diego. And these Jewish professors were like, why would I move to UCSD to become a professor if I can't live in my community? Because it was illegal for Jews to live in La Jolla, where UCSD's campus is. And so then the university used its power to petition, essentially, to get those restrictive covenants lifted. So when you talk about Jewish identity in America, it's complicated. But by the way, it's not just complicated for Jews. It's got Arab Americans actually were among the first to file a lawsuit in the early 1900s to be legally considered white in America. It was a Lebanese Christian Arab who filed that lawsuit, and ultimately, because in large part because the judge didn't want to admit that Jesus wasn't white, and Jesus came from where? The Middle East, right? He said, okay, the Arabs are white in America, right? But today, because of anti-Semitism and because white, it's considered to be an insult to be white in America, just like it's considered to be an insult to be colonialist, getting back to that, right? Arabs in America are not considered white, right? They're considered brown, regardless of the shade of their skin, right? And there are many Arabs who are paler than I am, frankly, right? But Arabs in America are not considered white. Linda Sarsour is much more pale than me. Her dad is for sure much more pale than me, right? And they're considered to be brown people in America. And again, this has nothing to do with anything biological because it's not real. This is a construct, right? And it's a construct that has nothing to do with Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood. And as you noted, in Israel, it's obviously farcical on the superficial level of the phenotype because Jews are every shade of peach, brown, mocha, and black in Israel. And and to call, as I noted in my article that you read, which was one of the reasons, or that I wrote, and that you read, which is one of the reasons you asked me to be on your podcast. Zionist Yemenite Jews trekked across the Arabian Peninsula to this land in the 1880s and in the early 1900s repeatedly and set up communities, Yemenite Jewish communities in this town, in this country. And to call them white colonialists is clearly absurd, right? They were Zionists and they were Jews from Yemen who were suffering, by the way, as all Jews in Arab land suffered from discrimination, persecution, and sometimes even massacres. And they dreamed of living in this land as free people, as Jews have for millennia.
I agree with you that that this whole concept of Jews being white is an American-centric construct because I come from Holland. I grew up with the, you know, with I grew up with the older generation being Holocaust survivors. I grew up with the stories of these people, you know, that they could survive somehow the Holocaust in Holland by being in hiding or so, and having to dye their hair blonde, you know, if you would not be blonde and have blue eyes during the Holocaust, you were suspected of being Jewish, and that could lead to a further investigation and you being brought to the camps. They would find out you're Jewish. So Jews were trying to look more white to survive the Holocaust. So it's very painful to me to hear that Jews are white and that is a bad thing.
Wherever there is a dominant culture, a dominant group that provides certain privileges and benefits to being part of that group, and there are minorities living amongst them, those minorities have always tried, when they can, to quote, pass. The fact that you can pass, or that some of the people of your group can pass, doesn't make you that other group, that dominant group. As I said before, Arabs in the United States fought legal battles to be considered white. African Americans in the United States, there's a sad history of many who could pass for white, living lives as, quote, white people in America so they could get the benefits of whiteness. Right? It didn't mean they were white. They weren't. They were passing. And Jews in America certainly received sometimes conditional whiteness in a way, right? But it was conditional. And in many respects, you were never truly considered part of the club. You were otherized nevertheless. And obviously, as you noted, Evelyn, in Europe, it's laughable to think of Jews as white people in Europe. We literally 6 million of us were slaughtered precisely for not being considered what Europeans under their social construct believed were white. We were always the other in European societies, regardless of whether it was in enlightened Holland or much less enlightened Ukraine at the time, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And everywhere you were in Europe, our passports, our birth certificates, our national identity papers signified that we were not white, right? It was clear whether you were Italy, as you were Hebreo, if you were in Germany, you were Juden, and I'm sure in Holland, if I recall correctly, it was also some Dutch version of Jewish, but it was on your identity papers.
Right. Back to Zionism. Many who cancel Zionists and Zionism, like the Dutch pop singer Douwe Bob recently did, claim this is not anti-Semitic, that they hold nothing against Jews or Judaism, and that Jews are among their best friends. Do you agree that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic?
No, I definitely disagree with that. Here's the caveats. If you're one of the few people in the world who believes that no nation on earth should exist, that all borders should be erased, you're a one world Marxist, right? And you truly believe that. And on top of that, you don't want to destroy the one Jewish state first as the key to getting this one state utopia. Then I'll give you I'll say you're not. If you're anti-Zionism based on that and that alone, then you're not an anti-Semite. But that's like 10 people. Right? The reality is that anti-Zionism is just, as Rabbi Sachs said, the latest version in the mutating virus of anti-Semitism. And all you have to do to sniff this out a little bit is just do the double standard test. If they said that about people who want Armenian independence, or people who are pro-Armenia's independence, or people who are pro-Cyprus being for Cypriots, right? Or Greece being for Greeks, would you say, oh, you're not anti-Greek? I have some great Greek friends. Some of my best friends are Greek. But the ones who want Greek independence, who don't believe Turkey should control all of Greece, they're disgusting. I hate them, right? So if you're taking a position, and by the way, it's important also to understand, like, Israel is 50% of the world's Jews. And something like 95% of the Jews in Israel are Zionists, meaning they believe the Jewish state, all Zionism is you believe the Jewish state should exist and has a right to exist within the confines of the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people. Not necessarily every inch of it, but somewhere in it, right? That's all it means. And so that's almost all of Israel, which is half the world's Jews. And among the other half that are not in Israel, it's probably somewhere between 80 to 90% of those Jews, right? So basically you're saying of the 15 million Jews in the world, about 14.5 million of them, 90% roughly, are Zionists. So to say that I am not anti-Semitic because I like 5% of the population of a group, or at least I don't hate 5% of the population of a group, is as ridiculous as it sounds. Like saying, I am not racist against Black people. I just don't like Black people who believe in the civil rights movement. Well, that's probably 95% of all Black people, right? Nobody would for a second agree with you that you're not a racist if that was your position. So why would we agree with anybody saying this nonsense about Zionism? Zionism is a core part of Jewish identity. You can argue, if you want to argue that 100 years ago, when the idea of a Jewish state surviving and Jews being able to have a thriving state in this land was something that only somebody who was a true dreamer could believe, and you said you were against Zionism, and you thought that it might endanger Jews or whatever, okay, maybe then. But today, when half the world's Jews live here, and 90% of the other half support this state continuing to exist, if you're saying you're anti the existence of the state, you're anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and also in the definition that is accepted by most Western countries the IRA definition, IHRA definition.
IHRA, yes.
Yeah,
International Holocaust Remembrance
it
Alliance.
says denying the Jewish state to exist is a form of anti-Semitism. You can criticize the state and its policies and its government, etc., but that's not anti-Semitic. But if you say it should not exist at all, is anti-Semitic for the reasons that you
100%.
said.
And
Yes.
we also can see like how the traditional, I don't know, traditional makes it sound like it's a good thing, how the classic anti-Semitic tropes from before Israel became a country about Jews, how they've morphed into being about Israel. So before Israel's existence, Jews, through some
You mean as a state?
before the existence of the state of Israel as a modern state in 1948,
Right.
Anti-Semites would say Jews, some cabal of Jews control the world, some cabal of Jews control the world's finances, some cabal of Jews control America, right? Today, what do they say? They say, this is racists say like ZOG, Zionist occupied government. They refer to Washington, D.C. as ZOG, Zionist occupied government. The Israel controls, Israel lobby controls. So now it's about Israel, but before Israel was the Jews. Before 1948, it was the Jews are uniquely violent to children. Jews are baby killers. Jews want children's blood, right? So today it's Israel. Israel is somehow uniquely violent towards children. Israel is somehow a unique baby killer, right? Ignoring all the wars in which children have been killed all over the world. It's the Israelis. It's the Jews in Israel. They're the ones, right? They're the bloodthirsty ones. And and of course before 1948, the anti-Semites would boycott Jewish businesses. Jewish businesses should be boycotted. Now, what is it? Boycott Israeli businesses, right? It's the tropes and the treatment run. There's a through line in all of this, and as Ira says, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition says, again, just do the test. If your attacks on Israel are unique to Israel, if your focus and attention on one country is just Israel, right? You're anti-war, but the only war you ever care about is the one that Israel fights. You never write about, protest about, talk about, and get exacerbated about any other war anywhere in the world, including wars with millions and millions of casualties. And I think people need to understand it's a terrible thing how many people have died in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I wish, my father served in the Israeli army. I served in the Israeli army. My son served in the Israeli army. I fear my grandson will serve in the Israeli army. I wish none of us had to serve. And we've lost family members to terrorism in this country. We've had people injured in war in this country in my family. It's terrible. But in the grand scheme, if you think about the world, right, in the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948, since Israel declared its independence and 6 Arab armies and 3 local Arab militias tried to wipe the nascent Jewish state off the map, there have been about 150,000 casualties total in this war, fatalities, total. It's a terrible number. It's a lot of people. But let's have some perspective. In Yemen, just in the past 10 years, at least 500,000 people have died in their civil war. At least. And we don't really know because nobody counts accurately there. In the Syrian civil war, just to the north of me, at least 600,000 people have died, and they're discovering more and more mass graves in Syria. So the number's probably way higher. In Chad, in the 21st century, I think the number is 2.4 million people killed. In the Sudan also, we're talking about millions. Obviously, we don't know the numbers yet, but Ukraine and Russia's war were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of fatalities, right? And I could go on and on and on. Since 1950 until the turn of the century, so from 1950 to 2000 roughly, something like 10 million Muslims were killed in wars with other Muslim countries against each other. Terrible loss of life. And none of the people, I shouldn't say none, but I'd bet you something in the neighborhood of 99% of the people who are screaming about Israel and screaming ceasefire so Israel can let some Hamas off the hook right now have never written a single angry word about any of these wars with millions and millions and millions of lives lost. And when they tell me, oh, the American ones tell me, that's because my tax dollars don't pay for those wars, I say, BS. In Yemen, whose weapons were killing half the people there? Those were American weapons. Whose ally was doing that? Saudi Arabia. You don't know that. You know why? Because no Jews are involved. So you don't tell me anti-Semitism doesn't have a role in this. And there are conflicts all over the world where American taxpayers' dollars are involved. And yet nothing animates these people like Israel does.
So
and at the end of the day, it's anti-Semitism.
So you're saying there's anti-Semitism involved in that selective outrage about,
of course,
the dead people caused by the Arab-Israeli conflict. And
look, people on the progressive side of politics in America, they understand selective outrage and how it can be racist all the time, right? They recognize that in highly racist communities, that when somebody gets animated, when an African American person commits a crime, but they don't get similarly animated and scared and ring alarm bells when a quote unquote white person commits that crime, right? What is animating that selective outrage? They understand it. They understand it intrinsically. They know it's racist, and it is. But somehow, when TikTok and Instagram gets all these people only thinking about one war in the entire world, there's dozens of wars going on right now, many with far greater casualties, and by the way, far greater risk of famine and starvation and all the things that animate everybody right now about the war in Gaza. And yet nobody cares about it. Nobody talks about it. Nobody writes about it. Nobody certainly is marching in streets by the tens of thousands protesting about it. Why?
Yes.
Because
Why?
of anti-Semitism. That's the only reason. It's endemic, it's systemic, and it's intrinsic.
And better propaganda by the
but why
Palestinians
but the propaganda sticks for a reason, right? No, it sticks for a reason. Nobody cares. 1 million Uyghurs, Muslims, are in Chinese concentration camps right now as we're speaking. Nobody cares about it. There have been articles about it. People have written about it. The Uyghurs themselves certainly have been trying to ring alarm bells about it. It gets no traction anywhere. Why? Right? Because anti-Semitism sells very easily.
Do you think the anti-Zionism in America or elsewhere is dangerous for Israel, for Jews in the diaspora like America? And what can our listeners do to defend Zionism?
Well, first and foremost, to defend Zionism, to defend Judaism, because I think they go hand in hand. The first thing to do is to be proud. Be more Jewish. Be more proudly Jewish. Be more openly Jewish. Don't let the anti-Semites cow you. Don't let them scare you. I walk around with my Magen David everywhere I go.
Your Star of David.
Yeah. My Star of David, right? And even though I consider myself, by Israeli terms, I'm Masorti, which is traditional. So in Israel, I'm not a kippah wearing Jew. But in America, after the Monsey attack on the Chabad Hanukkah party in what was it, 2019, in Hanukkah of 2019, there was a guy went through a Hanukkah party with a machete and he butchered a bunch. He seriously wounded a bunch of people and he ended up killing the rabbi. That moment that happened, when I was living in America at that time, because I made Aliyah again in 2022, I wore a kippah everywhere I went. I'm going to be more openly Jewish because of this. So that's my first thing I'd say to our listeners. Be more openly Jewish. Be more proudly Jewish. Do more Jewish things. Go to synagogue more. Contribute to your synagogue more. Just be more Jewish. That's the first thing. Secondly, learn our history. If somebody tells you that, like I've heard, like we talked about before, the Ashkenazi Jews don't come from the land of Israel. They're all from Europe. They're converts from the Khazars, the Khazar theory, myth, nonsense, right? Know the history. Know that the archaeological evidence, the historical evidence, all the original source documentation are obviously our memories, and our all credible genetic tests demonstrate that all Jews come from the Levant, come from Judea. No matter what our skin tone is. All of us originate here. Multiple credible genetic studies. So know the history. Know when something's nonsense. When somebody tells you, oh, before 1948, Arabs and Jews lived peacefully together all over. It was a nirvana, a utopia of wonders until Zionism ruined everything. Know that that's nonsense. Understand why it's nonsense. Understand that, while certainly European anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews was worse generally than the persecution and anti-Semitism that Jews faced in Arab-controlled dictatorships. Obviously, the Holocaust was on a scale that was different from all others, but that generally speaking, between the year 627 until the year 1948 in Arab lands, life for Jews was definitely not a picnic. And often there were mass pogroms, mass murder, and we don't have to, it wasn't just in the 19th century or the 18th century or the 20th century. It goes back to the beginning. There were massacres of Jews in the 7th century in Arabia. There were massacres of Jews in the year 1000 when Granada was under Muslim control. 5,000 Jews in Granada murdered in the year 1066 in one day alone. And these were on repeat. And even when they were massacring us in these lands, we were subject to what they call dhimmi laws. Right? They characterized it as being people of the book who are subject to protection. But it's the kind of protection that people are used to getting in neighborhoods where the gang comes up to you and says, "We're going to protect your store if you pay us $1,000 a week. And if you don't pay us $1,000 a week, that protection might lead to something else." Right? That was the kind of protection Jews had in Arab-controlled lands before the land of Israel, before the state of Israel existed in modern times. It was, you paid extra taxes if you were Jewish. You couldn't ride a horse because a Jew couldn't be above a Muslim in those lands. You couldn't build a synagogue that was the same height as a mosque. You couldn't. A Jew's word in court was not equal to a Muslim. So if a Jew wanted to sue a Muslim in court for being wronged in these countries, they had to have Muslim witnesses. And if you didn't have a Muslim witness, you were done. Right? And you have to pay those Muslim witnesses to appear on your behalf. In those countries, if a non-Jew walked up to your door and said, "I want to sleep in your home," you had to let them in and let them in your bed. You had to leave your bed as a Jew. And in Iran, I have Iranian friends. I think, Phyllis, you mentioned having Iranian friends, Iranian Jewish friends. Two generations before the Shah, so not that long ago, in Iran, the law was that when it was raining, a Jew couldn't go outside because the Jew dirt off their skin might get on a Muslim. And if a Jew was outside during the rain, they were subject to criminal penalties.
Yeah.
So, and in the land of Israel, my grandfather was born here in 1900. He was of the seventh generation of Jews born in this land. He knew Arabic fluently. He knew Turkish fluently. Lived under Ottoman rule, and he certainly knew what his place was in this country at that time. He was a second or third class citizen, and there were riots and massacres of Jews well before modern Zionism came about in this land. In 1834, the Jews of Tzfat, the Jews of Jerusalem were subject to brutal massacres for being Jewish. So anybody who says, "Oh, we just need to get rid of Israel and then there'll be peace in this land," that's like a white supremacist in the South talking about the good old days when in his mind the black people knew their place. That's really what they're talking about. They won't say it out loud, but that's what they're saying.
Okay.
So, Micha, this has been an incredible experience. I just want to add that it never occurred to me, and I know a great deal, that when you do archaeology research in different countries, that the language of the artifacts tells a story that, it just never occurred to me. Anyway, I want to thank you so very much. This has been just incredible. I want to thank our listeners. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our work, please go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please, whenever you can, be a proud Jew and speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.
Amen.